Hello, dear students. This is Craig with some thoughts on chapters 7 and 8 from Conway's The Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy. I had some fun with this title, as you might notice. I want to offer some sort of big picture thoughts on what Conway is doing with 7 and 8 and on how these chapters, which are coming almost at the end of the book now, are building on what's come before. So I think one thing to note is that this really is one extended argument from the beginning of the book on through chapter 9. Early on in the text, we're getting a lot of groundwork. We're getting a lot of, hey, here's things you need to know about how God works. Here's things you need to know about how creation works. Here's things you need to know about the relationship between God and creation. Here's how Christ is the mediator. And so she's really laying out all these pieces of a puzzle for about the first 4 or 5 chapters. And then the second half of the book, she starts putting all those pieces together to show you this picture of, well, it's supposed to be sort of a picture of everything, really, and about how all these things work. And so one of the things that I think is helpful in trying to understand the details of chapters 7 and 8 is to notice that all of these things come back to the monism that she's been building up for most of the book thus far. The idea is that there's all these philosophical problems. Some of them are really contemporary things in the sort of new science that was happening in the early modern period. A lot of it is stuff that's coming about as a result of the work that Descartes is doing. And she's saying, hey, there's all these problems. I can solve them with my version of monism embedded in this sort of Christianity that's filtered through this mystical Kabbalism and Neoplatonism, and then sort of all tied together in Conway's kind of unique way of doing it. There's a lot of details in these chapters, and I think the discussion forum is a good place to jump into those specifics, the specific questions you're having, the things that are giving you trouble understanding, the things that a lot of y'all are asking where you're saying, hey, I get that Conway says X, but how does that fit with Y? I think those questions are a really good source of conversation for us in the discussion forums. So moving into chapter 7 here, Conway has made these claims, right, that body and spirit are essentially the same thing. She says they're of one nature, that they're of one substance, that they are essentially the same. And to say that is to say whatever differences we see don't come down to what defines the thing as what it is, don't come down to making it completely different from something else. They just come down to sort of relatively more or less minor differences. They're just different attributes or different characteristics, right? And so the typical kind of intro philosophy sort of example, I think, is, right, I change my clothes like most days, right? I wear different clothes. I can take my glasses on or put them back, take them off or put them back on. Sometimes I have my cell phone with me. Sometimes I don't. I'm still me, even across those changes. The thought is those things are just different modes, attributes, characteristics that are sometimes there, sometimes not. I can still be me without those things, or across the changes of those things. There's actually a lot of changes I can go through and still be me, right? So I'm a lot older now than I was when I was a fetus or an infant or a toddler or a teenager or anything like that. So that whole process of human development, I can still be the same thing pretty far through that process. Conway's been claiming that when you think about body and spirit, or matter and mind, right, physical stuff and not physical stuff, that the best way to understand the relationship between those things is a monistic one. Monistic is just to say, hey, there's only one kind of thing here. It's not that there's multiple kinds of things. There's only one kind. Body and spirit are actually essentially the same kind of thing. They're just different gradations of the thing, right? All the different attributes, characteristics that you can list about how body works or about how spirit and mind work, you can lay those all out on one long line, and they all belong on the same line, right? They're just, you can be more airy, or you can be a little more thick and dense. Doesn't mean that you're essentially a different thing. We just call spirit the stuff that's sort of more airy, light, other characteristics that she gives. And the kind of main characteristics of body are things like, she says grossness and crassness, and that means stuff like thickness and density and coarseness and all these other sensible qualities, things that you could tell by looking at it or touching it or stuff like that. She says that doesn't make it essentially different. It's really just the same thing, just more or less of these different characteristics. This is important because when she's saying in chapter 9 that her philosophy is anti-Cartesian, what she's saying is, in part, that it's anti-dualistic. Right? The dualists say there's essentially two kinds of things in the universe. There's body and there's mind. She says there's one. Body and mind are the same kind of thing. So she's using this. There's tons of different arguments. Most of what she's doing is saying, hey, on the assumption that body and mind or body and spirit are actually the same kind of thing, we can better solve all these difficulties in metaphysics and the philosophy of how things like movement work, how time works, that we can solve those kinds of things better, that we can solve these questions about the relationship of the creation to God, that we can solve all these things a lot better with this monistic view. And of course, her specific version of a monistic view. And then other things that she's talking about aren't so much about these scientific kinds of questions like physics stuff, like motion and time. It's stuff about like ethics and religion, right? How do we explain when things are good or evil, and the movement between those? How do we explain things like suffering? So primarily, she seems to be talking a lot about motion, right? Motion in terms of movement, like how does a body get from one place to the other? That comes up a lot. But also motion like just change, which she's already defined motion as really just being the sort of action and change of creatures. She's saying we can better understand how things change if we don't think of body and spirit as being fundamentally different. So instead of saying, okay, body has this one set of attributes, right? It's penetrable and indivisible, and spirit is divisible and impenetrable, or these different things. She says, look, instead of saying they have diametrically opposed characteristics that make them opposites, and then we have to try to figure out how spirit is able to move the body, or other things about the relationship between spirit and body. This is called the mind-body problem in philosophy. It's a huge problem if you're a dualist, like Descartes. Conway says, well, look, we can see that body is by nature the kind of thing that moves. God made it that way. God made it the kind of thing that has a principle of motion, action, life in it. Because body is just the same thing as spirit. It's just slightly different attributes, more or less of things. So it's not that spirit is alive and body is just stuff, and then you have to figure out, well, how does the spirit get in the body and make it do stuff? She thinks that's the wrong picture. They're essentially the same thing. Notice that means, right? The hills are alive with the sound of music. You've got to take that kind of literally if you're following Conway's argument. But she thinks, look, there's all these other things too. It's not just motion. If we think about how love and desire work, we can understand, right? The kind of thing that threw people like Socrates and Plato for a loop, right? So why is it that if we are essentially these things that aren't tied to a body, why do we care so much about these physical things? Conway has an answer for that, because we're not just spirits in the material world. I'm going to quote a lot of songs apparently. We're not just that. And so there's not this opposition to overcome, right? The problem goes away if you start by assuming that it's really beginning in similarity. Furthermore, I mean, this is kind of interesting, right? How does memory work? She thinks that understanding that there's, infinite spirits within spirits, or infinite spirits within a body, and infinite bodies within a body, that helps to explain how memory works. So just a cool little thing there. Moving into chapter 8, a lot of these arguments about motion are still happening, right? There's kind of a continued numbering. Oh, and here's another argument about this. Oh, and here's another argument about this. But we also get more of a moral religious interpretation of what's going on. So she has an explanation for sin, this religious concept of sin, that she puts in terms of motion. And that means that the solution to sin, the sort of way if one has fallen into sin to get out of it and make a return to the good, is also in a kind of terms of motion. And you get this a lot in Neoplatonism, right? You have some of y'all are already asking about this on the discussion forum. You get these myths of a fall even before Christianity. You get these myths of a fall, and the idea is the fall of a spirit into matter is how it usually turns out. Conway's kind of working with that, and then obviously there's ways in which she's not, right? Because she's trying to say that body is essentially a good thing. It's not essentially an evil thing. So it can't just be that spirit falls into matter, and that makes it bad and spirit's good. She wants to say spirit and body are good, though at the same time she kind of thinks that some qualities of body are a sign of badness. And part of the movement that's going on with sin and redemption is a movement to the sort of more thickness and density and coarseness and these other qualities of body, or a sort of being freed from those qualities of body. But you get this in most Neoplatonisms, right? There's some kind of return to the good after a fall. And she's literally trying to give an explanation in terms of this monistic relationship between spirit and body and how that motion can work. So she thinks it helps to explain the experience of suffering. And if y'all read the editor's introduction to the text, this is sort of an extra textual thing, right? It's not something that she talks about in the passage exactly, but if we kind of think about her personal situation, it might shed some light. Anne Conway was a person whose medical condition was such that she experienced incredible suffering. She was pretty much constantly in incredible physical pain for the last 10 years or so of her life, which is the time during which she's writing this. So there's a way in which this experience of suffering, which for her was a very personal experience, she thinks she kind of gets a way to understand it and what's happening and why it's happening through her philosophical theory. And she thinks it also helps to explain death, right? So if you think that body or matter is just stuff and then spirit's the real life inside it, then you think that death, a lot of people think of it this way, right? And you get this in Casper the Friendly Ghost, right? Casper, if something dies and then Casper sort of rises up out of the dead thing and floats away. And she thinks there's actually a lot of problems. So, well, why did the spirit go in the body in the first place? And why does the spirit leave the body now? She doesn't think the dualists have a good answer for that. She thinks monism helps to explain it. And this kind of explanation turns death into just another kind of motion, right? When we think of motion as a change, it's just another kind of change. And that then further helps with her arguments about moral improvement and redemption, right? So death is just a change from one state to the other, and that change could be a sort of change from less good to more good, depending on the situation. I think given the number of details in this text, given the complexity of some of the arguments, so she's really good at giving really short arguments, lots of them, building them on each other. But because of that, it can be a little dense. So here's my suggestion. Ask who is Conway talking to here. Some of the things she's saying she might introduce it by saying like, well, you know, those who say this or those who object to this. Sometimes she's responding to someone who might have like a scientific question, right? There's people, philosophers, physicists, which at that time weren't different things, right? So a lot of what we call science now was once part of philosophy. Right? Isaac Newton was a philosopher, just to note that sort of thing. So people who are asking these questions about, well, how does motion work? How does change work? What is matter? What is spirit? What is body? How about atoms? That's all coming out of philosophy. So sometimes she's trying to respond to those people and saying, hey, here's how monism helps to answer that question. Sometimes she's responding to a potential objection to something she said or something that maybe she's about to say. And so there's arguments about, well, spirit and body are the same thing. And people might say, aha, that can't be right, because here's a counterexample. And so she's responding to those potential counterexamples. And then sometimes, right, she's trying to make it clear how her philosophy is either helping to explain something in her version of this Christian religion that's mixed with the Kabbalism, that's mixed with the Neoplatonism, that personally speaking involves a Quaker view, which would not have been the majority religious view at the time, although the Quakerism doesn't seem to clearly come out in this text. Sometimes she's just trying to say, hey, I can help explain this religious thing, or hey, in case you were worried and you were going to make an objection that what I'm saying doesn't fit with religion, it does, and here's why. A lot of that is why she's saying the things she's saying, right? She's not just rambling about this stuff. She has really specific things, and even if she doesn't always say, here's the question, here's my answer, if you take a moment to think for yourself, what if what she's saying is supposed to be an answer, what would the question be? If you can formulate that for yourself a little bit, that will help you to understand why she's saying the things she's saying, and I think can shed light on some of the details of exactly what she's saying. Also, some of this stuff's just still going to be hard to understand, right? I mean, I've been reading this text for years and teaching it. I've had a serious research interest in Neoplatonism for more than a decade. There's still a lot of details in this text that I find difficult, right? There's scholarship that's continuing, right? We haven't figured it all out yet. There's still continuing scholarship on Conway and on this text and how this text fits into other things that were going on at that time. In general, for what we're doing with philosophy, with philosophical texts, and probably anything at all, keep reading. Usually stuff later on is going to be a key that helps to unlock earlier stuff. So there's this idea of a hermeneutic circle that says you've got to get in and you start getting some of the parts of what you're reading. And from that, you form an idea of the whole. Then you can use that idea of the whole to come back and you can better understand those parts. And it keeps going that way, right? The circle doesn't necessarily ever end, right? The more you kind of understand some of the details, you can get a better sense of why the big picture looks the way it does. And then the clearer sense of a big picture you get, the more you can use that to help with interpreting the details. And so it's a sort of reinforcing way to work through your understanding of a text, right? So if you do get stuck on something, don't reread the same paragraph 5 times and say, I still don't get it. Move on to the next paragraph, move on to the next paragraph. And once you get some ideas about all the things that are there, you can start using them as little secret decoder rings for yourself. All right, let's talk about more details on the discussion forum. Let me know which kind of specific elements of the arguments are throwing us for a loop, which things you find interesting or important, right? Are there questions that you've had about suffering or death, or how motion works or anything like that, where you think that what Conway's saying is kind of giving you a different perspective on that question? Those could be interesting things for us to talk about.